I was a loner kid. I played by myself. I invented little worlds in my imagination. I was kind of interested in, nonetheless, being in the world. So somehow photography is this way of like being in the world, but for me also not being in the world or being in my own space. And it's interesting because I've done a lot of road photography, and the automobile sort of functions that way too, where you're in the world and removed. I'm not saying this is the recipe for psychological health, but it is a medium that worked for me in that way. I think the allure of the open road is really sort of built into the American psyche in some ways, and so it was just in there. And then it's also, of course, within the history of photography as well. It came with my bottle as a baby or something. I don't know, it's in the water. Photography is a language, and I speak this American dialect of the photographic language. Wanderlust is linked, for me at least, to sort of daydreaming and the kind of wandering that we can do in our heads. And I wanted to use this medium of photography, which is really so much about the world out there, but connect it kind of with the world in here. I wouldn't want to give the impression that this is like a primary ambition of mine, but it's someone who does live in the middle of America in flyover country. I'm interested in paying attention to it. Over the years, I worked for a lot of magazines, and it's sometimes funny where it's like, Minnesota, Montana, Michigan, they're all the same kind of state. So, and I'm interested in the nuances that exist in the country. I live in the north, and it's a colder climate, both in weather, in real climate, literally, and but it's a bit colder psychologically with sort of Nordic and German influence. And as you go south, you have much more African American influence, and it's just a very different culture, but also a more welcoming culture in a lot of ways. So for me, it was a way to explore, both like home and this other land within America. Even though I call myself a photographer and I try to make, beautiful photographs, the experience is primary in a lot of ways. My goal is, experience and expression. That is much closer to the realm of poetry than it is to journalism. There's nothing more powerful than storytelling. And photography is a fragmentary medium. So it's not great at conventional storytelling. Yet it has some elements of storytelling. But if you overemphasize those elements, sometimes you're taking away from the power of photography. So it's this constant wrestling match with the medium. Actually, a lot of people don't see the humor, but I really see a lot of humor and strive for that. But I don't strive to be ironic. I really want to be heartfelt, but also allow the sort of human comedy to come into play. I live in Minnesota. I cross the Mississippi River every day. So it's sort of an obvious path, but it's also this, this incredible metaphor for wanderlust. For, as corny as it sounds, the sort of American dream and the kind of like, you can hit the road and travel. But of course it has Mark Twain, it has other metaphorical meaning in terms of, slavery and freedom from much darker forces. In creating Sleeping by the Mississippi, I was looking for these repeating motifs, these ways to weave the pictures together. And, one of the primary ones was through beds and these kind of vehicles for dreaming. I mean, this is a strategy for putting pictures together. I don't think of myself as a photographer of the single image, and how do you get pictures to speak to each other? And sort of repeating motifs is one way to do that. I wasn't out looking for religion. That was not my intention at all. But yeah, you drive in the middle of America and religion's gonna rear its head. And then I found meaning in it as well. The funny thing about Niagara Falls is that I decided to do a project before I ever went there. So unlike the Mississippi River, which I knew, I just had this idea. And the place was actually very different than my idea of it. And to be honest, somewhat disappointing. With the work in Niagara Falls, I was kind of wrestling with that, with this, you know, the idea of the majesty of this water feature with the reality of this kind of sad place. I mean, the big thing is that I was using Niagara Falls as a way to talk about love. It's kind of, this feeling of decline in the place is something that was interesting to me and as a metaphor for like the way new love is this burst of energy, like this waterfall, and then it kind of fizzles out. Disenchantment, just the inevitable breakdown of that intensity. My big thing was, why use this waterfall, this place that's also a place for suicide, as a metaphor, you know, as the place to go for new love, this thing that can't sustain itself. There's a picture of this young bride who'd just been married. Her name's Melissa, and she's sitting outside of this wedding chapel, which is connected to a motel. And, you know, her future's ahead of her. And, you know, it's interesting to think about this now that, you know, if I saw her now, however many years have passed, and what was she picturing? What was she thinking about her future at that point, and what is her future now? This picture of the two towels is a funny one because it's one of those like dumb pictures, you know. I walked into this motel and the light was just right. It was coming in. I raced to take this photograph. And this is a good example of you never know what's gonna make it as a picture because it's really just a dumb picture, but it has this life to it and this humor to it that's lived on. The motel architecture there was so of another time. It's the way I think of Niagara Falls. It's like my grandparents' generation. Plus, it's just like eye candy. With Songbook, there were different elements. One was that I was functioning like a news photographer, and so I needed to be efficient. And so I used not just black and white, but also flash. And I was also trying to make reference to someone like Ouija, you know, early press photography. And I was also thinking about a pre-digital age in America where we think there was more social connection. For me, it was a way to explore social life in America as well as my own sort of desire for social life. With this work, I was collaborating with a writer, traveling with another assistant, meeting people out, engaged with the world, and you know, functioning like a photojournalist in some ways. It like put me out there. It was a series of trips, state-based trips originally. Our first state was Ohio, and we would travel the state and report on it, on these stories, and then create a newspaper from that. And we did a series of these. But Songbook, the idea was, unlike the sort of newsiness of these dispatches, was to produce this more lyrical experience of the work. I mean, photographs can be used in different ways and you can have different experiences with them. They're kind of different than like paintings in that way. A painting is a painting, but a photograph can function this way on a computer, that way in a book. You put text to it, it functions in a different way, and I like to play in different waters. I love this picture of Bill because I think it's a welcoming picture. He's sort of saying, dance with me, but it's also a picture of solitude. And this is this recurring thing in my work, is this desire for solitude, but also desire to communicate. This picture of Dave and Trish is one that I love deeply, and it's kind of a heartbreaking image because not too long after I made it, Dave died in a tragic accident. But it's also a picture that hides information, so the viewer projects information onto it and meaning onto it. It's a tender picture. With the songbook work, we were chasing after stories and events and that sort of thing. And then I was responding on the fly to whatever caught my, attention. I mean, it's linked to Niagara and looking at romantic love, but I think there's something a little like softer and more fleeting in that picture. I always say that photography functions more like poetry than it does the novel, where it's, in poetry you have these line breaks and these kind of gaps for the reader to fill in. And with photography, I try to leave those gaps, but not so many gaps that people don't understand what they're dealing with whatsoever. My whole thing about successful photographs is that they're anomalies. I still don't understand why one works and another doesn't, and they're just little mysteries. I think there are a lot of different elements. I mean, one is, the right mix of things in the picture itself, and then there are these external elements that come into play, which is why I don't strive to make iconic pictures. I try to make really good body of work, and hopefully, great pictures will come along the way.